Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where the ordinary turns into something you can't quite name. Tonight we're roaming the Appalachian Mountains, ancient peaks where fog rolls like ghosts and paths vanish without warning. Every story you're about to hear is rooted in truth, eyewitness accounts, family legends, and events locals still refuse to speak about after dark. This isn't a tourist guide, it's a map to the things hiding between the stones. Subscribe if you dare, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next whisper, and pull your jacket tighter. The first story rises now, like mist creeping down a hollow. Story 1. Breathing cave. I should have turned around the moment I heard it breathing. That was 3 weeks ago, and I still wake up every night to the sound of that slow, deep rhythm echoing in my ears. The doctors say it's trauma. They don't understand what I found in those mountains. What found me? My name is David Chen, and I used to be a geologist for the National Park Service. Used to be, because after what happened at Cumberland Gap, I can never go underground again. The thing is, I have to tell someone what is down there. What has been sleeping beneath the Appalachian Mountains for God knows how long. It started as a routine survey. The cave system at Cumberland Gap had been showing unusual seismic activity for months. Nothing major, just small tremors that registered on our equipment. Park officials were worried about tourist safety, so they sent me down to assess the structural integrity of the main passages. I explored hundreds of caves before. Mammoth Cave, Carlsbad Caverns, systems that stretched for miles underground. I thought I knew what to expect. Cold limestone walls, the drip of water, maybe some bats. I was wrong about everything. The entrance to Cumberland Gap, this cave system, sits about 2 miles off the main hiking trail. Most tourists never see it, hidden behind a curtain of mountain laurel and rhododendron. The opening itself is modest, maybe 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Nothing that would catch your eye unless you knew what to look for. I suited up with my standard gear, helmet with dual LED lights, rope, emergency beacon, enough supplies for a 6-hour survey. The park rangers who dropped me off would return at sunset. Plenty of time to map the anomalous areas and get back to the surface. The first thing I noticed was the air current. Every cave system has air movement. Temperature differences between the surface and underground create drafts, sometimes strong enough to blow out candles. But this was different. As I descended past the entrance chamber, I felt a steady push and pull of air that seemed almost rhythmic. Like the mountain itself was breathing. I made a note in my log and continued deeper. The main passage stretched ahead of me, wider than expected. My lights revealed smooth walls carved by centuries of water flow. But something felt off about the geology. The limestone showed stress patterns I'd never seen before. Hairline fractures that formed strange, organic shapes. Almost like veins running through living tissue. 20 minutes into the cave, I reached the first anomaly zone. My seismic equipment had detected unusual activity here, about 300 feet underground. The passage opened into a chamber roughly the size of a basketball court. And that is where I first heard it clearly. Breathing. Slow, deep, and impossibly large. I stopped dead, my lights cutting through the darkness. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating through the limestone walls. Each breath lasted maybe 10 seconds. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause, like something massive was sleeping just beyond my perception. I checked my equipment. No gas leaks, no structural damage that would create unusual airflow. The breathing continued, steady and unmistakable. My training told me to document everything, so I set up my recording equipment and tried to locate the source. The chamber had 3 passages leading deeper into the mountain. The breathing seemed strongest from the middle tunnel, a narrow crack that descended at a steep angle. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I squeezed through the opening. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for my shoulders. Rough limestone scraped against my gear as I worked my way down. The breathing grew louder with every foot of descent, but there was something else now. A smell. Organic and ancient, like the deepest part of a forest where things go to decay. After maybe 50 feet, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was different, vast. My lights couldn't find the far walls, and when I dropped a rock, it took almost 4 seconds to hit bottom. The breathing here wasn't just sound anymore. I could feel it, the air pressure changing with each massive inhale and exhale. I activated my emergency beacon to mark my location and began a systematic exploration of the chamber. The walls showed the same strange vein patterns, but here they were more pronounced. Almost like a circulatory system carved into solid rock. and they were warm to the touch. That's when I found the first sign that I wasn't alone down there. Scattered across the chamber floor were pieces of equipment. Old, rusted, but recognizably modern. A helmet with a cracked headlamp. Rope, frayed and moldy. A tattered backpack with a name tag I could barely read. Thompson, 1987. My heart started pounding as I realized what I was looking at. Thompson. I knew that name. Gerald Thompson, a cave researcher who had gone missing in these mountains 35 years ago. They searched for months but never found a trace. Now I was standing over his gear, 300 feet underground. I grabbed my radio, tried to contact the surface team. Nothing but static. The mountain was blocking my signal. I was completely cut off, alone with whatever was making that breathing sound. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately. Mark the location, return with a full team, proper equipment. But something about those ruins held me there. Thompson had found this place decades ago. What had he discovered that made him stay? What had happened to him? I found my answer at the far end of the chamber. The wall there was different from the rest. Smoother, almost polished, and carved into its surface were symbols. Not Native American petroglyphs or anything I recognized from archaeological training. These were older, more primitive, scratched deep into the limestone with desperate fingers. Thompson, his final message to the world. Most of it was illegible, worn away by decades of that warm, humid air. But I could make out fragments. Day 12, breathing louder. Something moving below. And at the bottom, carved in shaking letters, it knows I am here. The breathing stopped. Complete silence filled the chamber, so sudden and total that my ears rang. I stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe myself. For maybe 30 seconds, nothing. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Movement, far below, in the depths I couldn't see. Something fast shifting position, rock grinding against rock, and underneath it all, a sound like leather stretching. Like wings, I ran. No careful cave protocols. No systematic retreat. Pure animal panic drove me back through that narrow passage, scraping skin and tearing gear. Behind me, the chamber filled with sound. Not just movement now, but something that might have been communication. Low-frequency vibrations that I felt in my bones more than heard. I reached the main passage and kept running, my lights bouncing wildly off the walls. The breathing had started again, but faster now, excited, and I could swear it was following me, getting closer with each labored step I took toward the surface. 20 feet from the entrance, something grabbed my ankle. I went down hard, my helmet cracking against limestone. One of my lights went out. In the sudden dimness, I looked back and saw something that shouldn't exist. A tendril of living rock, smooth and warm, wrapped around my leg. It pulsed like a heartbeat and pulled me slowly back toward the depths. I kicked and clawed, tearing my fingernails against solid stone. The tendril tightened, and I felt bones in my ankle grinding together. More tendrils emerged from cracks in the walls, reaching for me with obvious hunger. I grabbed my emergency knife and started cutting. The blade scraped uselessly against what looked like rock but felt like skin. Then I remembered my rock hammer. One desperate swing severed the tendril holding my ankle. Dark fluid, thick as motor oil, sprayed across the cave floor. The mountain screamed, not a sound any human throat could make. A vibration that came from everywhere at once, so deep it made my teeth ache. The remaining tendrils retreated into their cracks, and I limped the final distance to daylight. The park rangers found me 3 hours later, unconscious just outside the cave entrance. Broken ankle, severe dehydration, signs of psychological trauma. They assumed I'd gotten lost in the dark and panicked. Cave explorers sometimes experience hallucinations from oxygen deprivation. I tried to tell them what I found. About Thompson, his remains, about the breathing, about what had tried to drag me back into the depths. They nodded politely and recommended therapy. The cave was sealed 2 days later. Official reason: structural instability. The seismic monitoring equipment was removed, and the area was declared off limits to researchers. When I pressed for details, I was told the decision came from Washington. Federal level, people who knew things I wasn't cleared to understand. But I know the truth. Something ancient sleeps beneath the Appalachian Mountains. Something that breathes like a living thing and feeds on whoever ventures too deep into its domain. Thompson found it in 1987. I found it 3 weeks ago. And someday, someone else will find it too. The nightmares started immediately after I got back. Every time I closed my eyes, I I'm back in that chamber, feeling warm tendrils wrap around my limbs. I hear that breathing in every air conditioner, every ventilation system. Sometimes I think it followed me home. Last night was the worst yet. I woke to the sound of my bedroom walls creaking, the same rhythm I heard underground. Inhale, pause, exhale, pause. When I turned on the lights, there were hairline cracks in my ceiling that hadn't been there before. They look like veins. I am writing this as a warning. Stay away from Cumberland Gap. Don't trust the official reports about structural damage. There are things in those mountains that were never meant to be disturbed. Ancient things that have been sleeping in the deep places of the earth since before humans walked upright. And I think I woke something up. The breathing is getting louder. Story 2. Siren, a song. The melody saved my life and almost killed me on the same night. That was 2 months ago, but I can still hear it in my dreams. A haunting tune that drifts across the water when the fog rolls in thick along the New River. The locals warned me about it, but I thought they were just trying to spook the outsider. Mountain folk love their ghost stories. I wish to God I had listened. My name is Jake Morrison, and I used to think I understood the wilderness. 20 years as a park ranger in Colorado taught me to respect nature, but nothing prepared me for what lurks in the oldest mountains on earth. The Appalachians hold secrets that go back millions of years, and some of them should stay buried. I came to West Virginia for a fresh start after my divorce. The National Park Service offered me a position managing the remote sections of the New River Gorge. Peaceful work, they said. Monitor campsites, maintain trails, help the occasional lost hiker. No mention of the thing that sings in the fog. My first week was normal enough. Beautiful country, some of the most pristine wilderness I had ever seen. The New River cuts through these mountains like a silver knife, carving gorges that drop hundreds of feet to churning rapids below. Ancient beyond measure, older than the mountains themselves. The geology textbooks say it might be the second oldest river in the world, flowing north when most rivers flow south, defying everything you think you know about how water moves. The cabin they assigned me sat on a bluff overlooking one of the river's most treacherous bends. Hawk's Nest Rapids, they called it. A quarter-mile of Class 5 whitewater that had claimed dozens of lives over the years. Even experienced kayakers gave it respect. The current there moved like a living thing, forming whirlpools that could suck down a full-grown tree. I should have paid attention to why the previous ranger left so suddenly. His name was Tommy Garrett, 15-year veteran who knew every trail and campsite in the region. According to his supervisor, Tommy just walked into the office one morning, turned in his badge, and said he was done. Refused to explain why. Packed up and moved to Arizona the same week. Desert country, as far from running water as you can get. The first time I heard the singing, I thought it was wind through the trees. October in the mountains brings heavy fog that rolls up from the river valleys. On my third week, I woke around midnight to the sound of something beautiful drifting through my cabin windows. A melody unlike anything I had heard before. Wordless but somehow familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. I stepped onto my porch and listened. The fog was so thick I could barely see the river below, but the song seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising and falling with an otherworldly grace that made my chest tighten with emotions I could not name. Loneliness, longing, a deep sadness that felt older than the mountains themselves. It lasted maybe 10 minutes before fading into silence. I stood there until dawn, hoping to hear it again, but only the normal sounds of the forest remained. Owls calling, water rushing over stone, the creak of old trees in the wind. I asked the locals about it the next day. Most just shook their heads and changed the subject. But an old-timer named Bill Crawford, who ran the bait shop near the bridge, pulled me aside after I bought coffee. He told me about Sarah Whitmore. Back in the 1880s, when riverboats still carried coal and timber down the New River, Sarah was the prettiest girl in 3 counties. Raven black hair, eyes like spring water, and a voice that could make angels weep. She fell hard for a riverboat captain named Jonathan Hayes, a smooth-talking man who promised to take her away from mountain poverty and show her the world. Hayes courted Sarah for 2 summers, filling her head with dreams of city lights and fine dresses. But when autumn came and the river ran low, he disappeared without a word. Sarah waited through the winter, then walked out onto the ice above Hawk's Nest Rapids on the coldest night of the year. They found her body 3 days later, frozen solid, caught in the rocks where the current runs deepest. Bill said the singing started that same spring. Beautiful but mournful, heard only on foggy nights when the river ran high. Men walking alone near the water would hear it and feel compelled to follow. Some made it home. Others were found days later, drowned in the rapids with peaceful expressions on their faces, as if they had died happy. I thanked Bill for the story and tried to forget about it. Local folklore? Nothing more. Every wilderness area has its legends. Ghost lights, phantom animals, mysterious sounds. Usually just misidentified natural phenomena combined with too much imagination. The singing came back 3 nights later. This time I was ready with a digital recorder and my best headlamp. The fog was even thicker, turning my familiar surroundings into an alien landscape. Trees emerged from the mist like ancient sentinels, their branches reaching toward me with gnarled fingers. The melody started just after midnight, drifting up from the river with hypnotic beauty. I followed the sound down the narrow trail that led to the water. My boots slipped on wet leaves as I descended through the fog, guided only by that haunting voice. The song grew stronger with each step, filling my head with images I could not explain. A woman in a white dress standing on the riverbank, dark hair flowing like water, eyes that held depths I could drown in. The trail ended at a small beach where kayakers sometimes put in during low water. Tonight the river ran fast and high, swollen by autumn rains. Foam crested the rocks in the middle of the channel, and I could hear the roar of Hawk's Nest Rapids just downstream. The singing seemed to come from directly across the water, maybe 50 yards away. I turned on my recorder and raised my headlamp. The beam cut through the fog, revealing nothing but churning black water and wet stone. But the voice continued, clearer now, not quite human but close enough to make my skin crawl with recognition. Like someone trying to remember how to speak after years of silence. Then I saw her, just at the edge of my light, standing knee-deep in the current. A pale figure in what might have been a dress, though it was hard to tell where fabric ended and water began. Her hair moved around her shoulders like smoke, and when she turned toward my light, I felt something break loose inside my chest. Her face was beautiful and terrible, high cheekbones and full lips, but her eyes were holes that seemed to pull at something deep in my soul. She raised one hand toward me, beckoning, and her mouth opened to release that otherworldly song. I took a step into the water. The current was stronger than expected, tugging at my boots with insistent fingers. The woman smiled, revealing teeth like river stones, smooth and white. Her song grew more complex, harmonies layering on harmonies until it sounded like an entire choir was calling from the depths. Another step, the water reached my knees, shockingly cold even through my waders. Part of my mind screamed warnings about hypothermia, about flash floods, about the deadly rapids just downstream. But her voice drowned out everything except the need to get closer. She was so beautiful, so sad. How long had she been waiting there, singing alone in the dark? How long since someone had truly seen her, truly heard her pain? I was waist deep when my boot caught on something underwater. A fallen log, maybe, or a submerged rock. The current immediately tried to sweep my legs downstream, and I had to grab a boulder to keep from falling. The shock of near disaster broke whatever spell held me. The woman was gone. I scrambled back to shore, my heart hammering against my ribs. The singing had stopped, replaced by the normal sounds of water over stone. My recorder showed 20 minutes of audio, though it felt like I had been in the river for only seconds. Back at my cabin, I played the recording. Static, 20 minutes of electronic noise with no trace of the melody that had nearly killed me. Whatever I had heard existed beyond the range of normal sound, in frequencies that touched something deeper than the ears. I should have requested a transfer the next morning, should have followed Tommy Garrett, this example, and gotten as far from running water as possible. Instead, I started researching Sarah Whitmore. The County Historical Society had records going back to the 1800s. Sarah was real enough. Born 1862, died 1883, exactly as Bill had described. But the details of her death were different from the folklore. She had not walked onto the ice in despair. According to the coroner's report, Sarah Whitmore had been found floating face down in Hawk's Nest Rapids on a warm spring morning, fully dressed, with no obvious cause of death. The investigating sheriff noted something strange in his report. Sarah's body showed no signs of drowning. Her lungs were clear, her skin unmarked by rocks or debris. She had simply died in the water, as if her heart had stopped from some internal grief too deep for her body to contain. More disturbing were the witness statements. 3 different men reported hearing beautiful singing near the rapids on the night she died. All described the same haunting melody, the same sense of being called toward the water. One had actually entered the river before his companions pulled him back. The singing had been going on for over a century. I found 17 documented cases of men drowning in hexed nest rapids under similar circumstances. Always on foggy nights, always alone, always with that same peaceful expression, as if they had found something wonderful at the bottom of the river. The most recent was Tommy Garrett, his predecessor, a ranger named Mike Santos who had disappeared 2 years ago. They'd never found his body. I stayed away from the river for a week after that, but the melody haunted my dreams. I would wake with tears on my face and a longing so deep it felt like physical pain. During the day, I caught myself staring at the water, wondering what it would feel like to let the current carry me away from all my problems. The divorce, the loneliness, the growing certainty that I had wasted most of my adult life. The fog returned on Halloween night. I was ready this time. Survival gear, emergency flares, a rope tied around my waist and anchored to a tree. If Sarah Whitmore wanted me, she would have to work for it. The singing started just after 11, more beautiful than ever. But underneath the melody, I heard something new. Desperation, hunger, a need so vast it made the mountains themselves seem small. I followed the sound down to the water, my safety line playing out behind me. She was waiting for me, standing in the same spot as before. But tonight she was different, more solid, more real. I could see the details of her face, the way her dress clung to curves that had not felt a lover's touch in over a century. She began to walk toward shore. The water barely resisted her movement, parting like silk around her legs. Her song grew more complex, weaving harmonies that spoke directly to the lonely places in my heart. She had been waiting so long, watching from the depths while the world changed around her. All she wanted was companionship, someone to share the eternal song that had become her existence. She reached the shallows and extended her hand toward me. Her skin was pale as moonlight and perfect as porcelain. I took a step forward, then another, until the water reached my ankles. The rope around my waist grew taut, but I barely felt it. Her fingers touched mine. Ice shot through my entire body, but not the painful cold of river water. This was the chill of deep time, of years beyond counting, of love that had curdled into something else entirely. Through her touch, I felt her story, not the simple tale of abandonment the locals told, but something far more complex and terrible. Sarah Whitmore had loved Jonathan Hayes with the intensity only possible in youth. When he left without explanation, that love had nowhere to go. It festered inside her, growing larger and more desperate with each passing day. She had not walked into the river to end her life. She had entered the water to call him back, believing that if she sang beautifully enough, sadly enough, he would hear her across whatever distance separated them in return. The river had other plans. The new river is older than complex life on Earth, carved when the first mountains rose from primordial seas. It carries memories in its current, the dreams and desires of everything that has ever drowned in its depths. When Sarah sang her heartbroken song, the river listened. It took her voice and made it part of itself, trapping her spirit in an endless loop of longing and loss. But a century of singing alone had changed her. The love she felt for Jonathan Hayes had been replaced by a more general hunger. She needed someone to join her song, to share the beautiful agony of eternal waiting. The men she had lured into the rapids over the years were not victims. They were candidates. None had been strong enough to survive the transformation, to become what she had become. Through her touch, I understood that I was different. Something about my own loneliness, my own capacity for obsessive love, made me a suitable match. She could make me like her, give me a voice that would harmonize with hers for the rest of time. All I had to do was let the river take me. The rope around my waist jerked tight, pulling me back to reality. My safety anchor held firm, and the sudden tension broke Sarah's grip on my hand. She staggered backward, her perfect face twisting with rage and desperation. Her song became a shriek that made my eardrums throb. I ran. The rope guided me back to shore even as the fog seemed to thicken around me, trying to hide the path. Behind me, Sarah's voice rose to inhuman volumes. No longer beautiful but terrible in its need. The river itself seemed to respond, the current growing louder and more violent. I did not stop running until I reached my cabin. Inside, I threw together a travel bag and called my supervisor. Family emergency, I said. Had to leave immediately. He could mail my final paycheck to my forwarding address in Colorado. I was on the road before sunrise, driving west toward mountains that were younger and safer. Mountains that did not remember when the world was different. But I can still hear her singing. Sometimes, when I am alone at night, the melody drifts through my dreams. Sad and beautiful and utterly patient, Sarah Whitmore is still waiting by the river, calling for someone strong enough to join her eternal song. The men who answer the call are found days later with peaceful expressions, as if they have finally found what they were looking for. I know because I almost joined them. Part of me wishes I had. The loneliness up here in Colorado is different but no less sharp. At least in the river, I would not have to face it alone. Sometimes I catch myself humming her melody. When that happens, I turn on every light in the house and play music loud enough to drown out the sound of my own voice. Because I know that if I ever sing her song completely, she will hear me no matter how many miles separate us. And she will find a way to bring me home. Story 3. Circle of Light. I was the seventh man who should have vanished that night. The only reason I am alive to tell this story is because my truck broke down 3 miles from Brown Mountain. By the time I hiked to the search site, my team was already gone. 6 experienced firefighters, men I'd known for years, had simply disappeared into the North Carolina wilderness. All that remained was their equipment arranged in a perfect circle, flashlights still burning bright, pointing outward into the darkness like some kind of warning. The official report called it an accident. Search and rescue teams combed those mountains for 2 weeks but never found a trace. The families held memorial services. The department installed a plaque. Everyone agreed it was a tragedy and tried to move on. But I know what really happened on Brown Mountain that October night. I know because I saw the lights. My name is Tom Bradley, and I've been a volunteer firefighter in Burke County for 18 years. I've pulled bodies out of car wrecks, fought wildfires that turned day into night, and seen things that would give most people nightmares. Nothing in all those years prepared me for what lurks in the mountains near Morganton. The search started simple enough. 8-year-old Kevin Marsh had wandered away from his family, his campsite near the Brown Mountain overlook. Kid was autistic, prone to walking off when something caught his attention. His parents found his empty sleeping bag at sunrise and called for help. By noon, we had 40 volunteers combing the trails. Standard grid search, nothing we hadn't done dozens of times before. The mountains there are steep but not particularly dangerous if you know what you're doing. Plenty of water, clear landmarks, well-maintained paths. Should have been a routine recovery, but Brown Mountain has never been routine. For over a century, people have reported strange lights in those peaks. Glowing orbs that dance through the trees, pulsing with colors that dawn to belong in nature. Scientists have offered explanations. Swamp gas, they say. Reflected car headlights. Atmospheric phenomena. The locals know better. The Cherokee who lived in these mountains before European settlement had stories about the lights. They call them the spirits of warriors who died in battle, forever searching for their way home. Early settlers reported seeing them during the Civil War and assumed they were the ghosts of soldiers killed in mountain skirmishes. But the lights are older than any human conflict. They've been dancing through those peaks since before the Cherokee, since before anyone walked upright in these ancient mountains. And they were not spirits of the dead. They were something else entirely. As afternoon turned to evening, our search team started reporting equipment malfunctions. Compasses spinning wildly, GPS devices showing impossible locations, radio communications filled with static that sounded almost like voices speaking in a language none of us recognized. The first lights appeared just after sunset. I was working the eastern grid with my team when Danny Rodriguez spotted them through the trees. Soft blue glows that seemed to hover just above the forest floor, moving with purpose through the undergrowth. Too steady to be fireflies, too large to be anything natural. We followed them deeper into the woods. The lights stayed just ahead of us, always visible but never close enough to identify. They pulsed in complex patterns that reminded me of Morse code, though the sequences made no sense. Our radio crackled with reports from other teams seeing similar phenomena throughout the search area. That should have been our first warning to retreat. Mountain rescue has strict protocols about unknown hazards, but we had a missing child to find. Kevin Marsh was out there somewhere, alone and scared in the wilderness. The lights might even be helpful, leading us toward his location. We followed them for over an hour, deeper into terrain none of us had explored before. Ancient forest where the trees grew so thick that our flashlights barely penetrated the canopy. The undergrowth was sparse, as if nothing wanted to take root in that soil. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. Our breath began forming clouds, and frost appeared on the ferns around our feet. In October, in North Carolina, the lights ahead of us grew brighter and more numerous, casting everything in an eerie blue glow that made shadows dance like living things. Then Danny found the first circle. It was maybe 15 feet across, carved into the forest floor with mathematical precision. The earth inside was bare, packed smooth as concrete. No grass, no leaves, no sign that anything had ever grown there. The soil felt warm to the touch despite the sudden cold, and it gave off a faint metallic smell that made my nose burn. More circles appeared as we climbed higher into the mountains. Dozens of them, all perfectly round, all completely sterile. They formed a pattern that hurt my eyes to follow, connecting in ways that suggested intelligence behind their placement. The lights gathered around the circles, hovering and pulsing in synchronized rhythm. My radio crackled with excited chatter from the other search teams. They were finding circles too, scattered throughout their grid areas. Some contained strange markings etched into the hard-packed earth. Others held objects that didn't belong in the wilderness. A child, this bicycle, decades old and perfectly preserved. A wedding dress still white as snow. A collection of photographs showing faces none of us recognized. We should have regrouped then, called for backup, contacted the authorities. But the lights were moving again, heading upslope toward the main ridge. And somewhere in the distance, we heard crying. A child crying, lost and afraid in the darkness. Kevin Marsh was up there somewhere, and those lights were leading us to him. We had no choice but to follow. The crying grew louder as we climbed, echoing off the mountain peaks in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. Sometimes it seemed to come from directly ahead, other times from behind us, as if the sound was moving through the forest independent of any physical source. The lights led us to a clearing near the summit where the trees opened up to reveal the night sky. Stars blazed overhead with unusual brightness, and the familiar constellations seemed rearranged into patterns I didn't recognize. In the center of the clearing stood the largest circle we had seen. This one was at least 50 feet across, and the earth inside glowed with its own pale light. Not reflected illumination from our flashlights, but something emanating from below the surface. The packed soil was covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The crying stopped. In the sudden silence, we heard something far worse. Voices calling our names from the darkness around the clearing. But we were the only search team in this area, and the voices didn't belong to anyone I knew. They sounded like us, but wrong. Familiar words spoken with inhuman inflection, as if something had learned our speech patterns but didn't understand what the sounds meant. The lights began moving faster, circling the clearing in complex spirals that made me dizzy to watch. Their blue glow intensified until they cast everything in stark relief, turning the familiar faces of my teammates into alien masks of light and shadow. That's when my truck chose to break down. 3 miles away, parked on the access road where I had left it, my engine seized with a grinding noise I felt more than heard. The psychic shock of metal tearing itself apart hit me like a physical blow, and I knew instinctively that my ride home was gone. I also knew that I needed to get back to my team immediately. The voices in the darkness were getting closer, calling names with increasing urgency. But they weren't calling for Kevin Marsh anymore. They were calling for Danny Rodriguez, for Mike Peterson, for each member of my search team by name. I started running back toward the clearing. The lights followed me, spinning through the trees like angry wasps. The temperature continued dropping until my breath came in thick clouds and ice began forming on my gear. Behind me, I heard sounds that might have been my teammates responding to those inhuman voices. Or might have been something else entirely. When I reached the clearing, it was empty. 6 sets of equipment lay arranged in a perfect circle around the glowing patch of earth. Backpacks, radios, emergency gear, all placed with the kind of precision that suggested ritual rather than abandonment. Their flashlights were still on, beams pointing outward into the forest as if marking the boundaries of some invisible territory. But my teammates were gone. No footprints led away from the circle. No signs of struggle or violence. 6 experienced outdoorsmen had simply vanished, leaving their equipment behind like some kind of offering. The lights gathered around me, pulsing with what felt like satisfaction. Through their glow, I saw shapes moving in the tree line. Tall figures that walked upright but moved wrong, as if they were copying human movement from memory rather than instinct. They stayed just beyond the range of my flashlight, but I could see their eyes reflecting the blue radiance like mirrors. The crying started again, but now it came from multiple directions, as if several children were lost in the wilderness around me. The sound was wrong, though. too perfect, like a recording played through speakers hidden in the trees. I realized that Kevin Marsh had never been crying at all. It was bait, a lure designed to draw search teams deep into the mountains, away from marked trails and radio contact. The lights, the circles, the impossible cold, all part of something that had been hunting in these peaks for far longer than human memory. And I was standing in the middle of its trap. The figures began moving closer, stepping into the edge of my light. They looked almost human at first glance, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, with limbs that bent at angles that made my eyes water. Their faces were the worst part, familiar features arranged in combinations that hurt to perceive. One of them had Danny Rodriguez, his eyes in Mike Peterson, his face. Another wore the smile of our fire chief on the head of a stranger. They were wearing my teammates like masks, badly fitted and grotesquely displayed. The lights began to pulse in unison, and I felt something tugging at the edges of my consciousness. A pull toward the glowing circle, toward those waiting figures, toward whatever had happened to my friends. I ran. My legs carried me downslope through forest that seemed to actively resist my passage. Branches caught at my clothes and gear, roots appeared underfoot to trip me, and the very air grew thick as syrup. Behind me, the lights gave chase, accompanied by voices that sounded more and more like my missing teammates. They called my name with increasing desperation, begging me to come back, to help them, to not leave them alone in the darkness. The voices were perfect imitations, so exact that part of me wanted to believe my friends had somehow survived and needed rescue. But I had seen what was wearing their faces. I made it to the access road just as the first search helicopters appeared overhead, their spotlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The lights pursuing me vanished instantly, as if they had never existed. The unnatural cold lifted, and suddenly I was just a tired firefighter standing alone on a mountain road, trying to explain why his entire team had disappeared. The official search lasted 2 weeks. Dogs, helicopters, ground teams, even some FBI specialists who asked questions about terrorism and cult activity. They found the equipment circle exactly as I described it, but the glowing patch of earth looked normal in daylight. Just packed soil with some unusual mineral deposits. No trace of my teammates ever surfaced. No bodies, no additional clues, nothing to suggest what had happened to 6 experienced outdoorsmen in familiar terrain. The case was eventually closed as an unexplained disappearance, and the area around Brown Mountain was quietly added to a list of locations where search and rescue operations required special federal oversight. But I know the truth. Something ancient lives in those peaks. Something that feeds on human curiosity and compassion. It uses the lights to lure people deeper into the wilderness, away from safety and witnesses. The missing child, the crying in the darkness, all carefully crafted lies designed to exploit our instinct to help. Kevin Marsh was found 3 days later, safe at his grandmother's house in Asheville. He had never been missing at all, just visiting family while his parents thought he was at the campsite. A simple miscommunication that cost 6 good men their lives. I moved to Florida after the memorial service. Beach country, where you can see for miles in every direction and nothing glows in the darkness except normal things like neon signs and fishing boats. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars shine particularly bright, I catch myself scanning the horizon for familiar blue lights. Because I know they're still out there, dancing through mountain forests, waiting for the next search party to follow them into the darkness. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear my teammates calling my name across the miles. They want me to come back, to complete the circle that I escaped. And every night, that invitation gets a little harder to refuse. Story 4. Hex the curse killed my great-grandfather in 1928. And it's been hunting my family ever since. I found the proof 3 months ago, buried in a trunk in my grandmother's attic after her funeral. Newspaper clippings, court documents, and a leather journal filled with handwriting that made my skin crawl just to read. The story my family never told me. The reason we moved away from Pennsylvania and never looked back. My name is Michael Remeyer, and I'm the last of my bloodline. Everyone else who carried our name died young and died badly. Car accidents, heart attacks, cancer that spread too fast to treat. The doctors always had explanations, but the dates tell a different story. Every 7 years, like clockwork, another Remeyer meets an unnatural end. My turn is coming. It started with my great-grandfather, Nelson Remeyer, who farmed 300 acres in York County, Pennsylvania. Good land in the shadow of the Appalachian foothills, where German settlers had brought old world traditions that mixed with new world fears. They called it pow-wow magic, a blend of Christian prayer and folk healing that most folks accepted as harmless superstition. But some practitioners went deeper into the darkness than prayer and herb remedies. According to the journal I found, Nelson had been suffering for months before he acted. Cattle dying without cause, crops failing despite perfect weather, and a wasting sickness that doctors couldn't diagnose. He was convinced someone had put a hex on him, and he knew exactly who. John Blymeyer lived on the neighboring farm, a strange man who kept to himself and practiced the old ways. People whispered that he could cure illness with a touch or curse someone with a glance. Nelson became obsessed with the idea that Blymeyer was slowly killing him with supernatural means. The murder happened on Thanksgiving night, 1928. Nelson drove to Blymeyer, this isolated farmhouse, with two other men who believed in the hex. They found the old powwow doctor sitting by his fireplace, reading from a book written in symbols none of them recognized. When Nelson accused him of witchcraft, Blymeyer just smiled and continued reading. That was when Nelson lost control. The beating was savage, recorded in brutal detail in police reports I found among the papers. They didn't stop until Blymeyer was unrecognizable, his blood soaking into the wooden floor of his cabin. But the worst part came after he was already dead. Nelson cut a lock of hair from the corpse and burned it in Blymeyer, his own fireplace, believing this would break any hex the man had cast. Instead, something far worse happened. According to Nelson's journal, the smoke from the burning hair formed shapes that moved against the natural draft of the chimney. Shapes that looked almost like words in a language he didn't recognize. The trial made national headlines. Reporters came from New York and Philadelphia to cover the hex murder, fascinated by the collision between modern law and ancient superstition. Nelson's defense attorney tried to argue temporary insanity brought on by supernatural persecution. The prosecution called it premeditated murder driven by greed and paranoia. But the evidence presented in court was unlike anything seen before in an American courtroom. Witnesses testified about cattle found arranged in perfect circles, dead without wounds or disease. Neighbors reported seeing lights moving through Nelson's fields at night, lights that cast no shadows and left no footprints in the soil. Most disturbing were the photographs. Crime scene images showed Blymeyer's cabin filled with strange symbols carved into the wooden walls and floor. Not just random scratches, but complex patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them from different angles. The local sheriff who took the photos swore they hadn't been there when he first searched the house. Nelson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died 6 months later in his cell, officially of a heart attack. But the prison doctor noted something strange in his report. Nelson's body showed signs of rapid aging, as if he had lived decades in the span of weeks. The journal entries stopped after the trial, but the family history I pieced together told the rest of the story. Nelson's son Thomas died in 1935, exactly 7 years later. Car accident on a straight road in perfect weather. The police report mentioned that he had been driving erratically just before the crash, as if trying to avoid something in the road that wasn't there. Thomas' son Robert died in 1942, another 7 years. Officially a heart attack at age 34. But his wife reported that he had been having nightmares for weeks before his death. Dreams about an old man with a burned face standing at the foot of their bed, speaking words in a language that hurt to hear. The pattern continued through my grandfather, my father, and now me. Every 7 years, another Blymeyer dies young under circumstances that medical science can explain but common sense cannot accept. I thought I had escaped the curse by moving to Colorado, putting 2,000 miles between myself and whatever haunted those Pennsylvania hills. I changed my name, started a new career, tried to forget the family history that my grandmother had hidden from me for 30 years. But you cannot outrun blood. The signs started 3 months ago, right after I turned 35. The same age Nelson had been when he killed John Blymeyer. Small things at first. Electronics malfunctioning around me, lights flickering when I entered rooms, and a persistent smell of smoke that followed me everywhere despite living in a non-smoking building. Then the nightmares began. Every night, the same dream. I am standing in a cabin that smells of old wood and dried herbs, watching an elderly man read from a book filled with symbols that hurt my eyes to perceive. His face is a ruin of burns and bruises, but his eyes are alive with an intelligence that predates human civilization. He looks up from the book and speaks my name. Not Michael, the name I've used for 15 years, but my real name. The name that connects me to Nelson Remeyer and the murder that started this cycle of vengeance. In the dream, I try to run, but the cabin has no doors. The windows show only darkness, and when I press my face against the glass, I see other faces looking back. Thomas, Robert, my grandfather, my father. All the Remeyers who died before their time, trapped in whatever hell John Blymeyer created with his final breath. The old man closes his book and stands. When he moves toward me, I can smell the smoke of burning hair and something else underneath. The copper scent of fresh blood and the sweet rot of a body 3 months in the ground. I wake up screaming. Last week, I hired a private investigator to research John Blymeyer, his background. What I learned made the nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. Blymeyer wasn't just a local folk healer. He was part of a network of practitioners who had been working in the Appalachian region since before the Revolutionary War. German immigrants who brought more than farming techniques and religious traditions to the New World. They brought something older, something that had survived the witch trials and religious persecution of Europe by adapting and hiding. The investigator found records of similar murders throughout Pennsylvania history. Farmers killing neighbors they accused of hexing, trials featuring supernatural evidence, and families suffering generations of tragedy afterward. All connected to practitioners who claim power over life and death itself. But Blymeyer was different. The record suggested he had been practicing for over 60 years when Nelson killed him. But photographs from the 1920s showed a man who looked no older than 40. Either the dates were wrong, or John Blymeyer had found a way to extend his natural lifespan far beyond human limits. The investigator disappeared before he could complete his research. I found his car abandoned on a back road near the old Blymeyer farm, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of struggle. Just another unexplained disappearance in a region that has seen too many over the decades. I drove to Pennsylvania last month, following a compulsion I couldn't resist. The Blymeyer farmhouse is still standing, though it has been abandoned for decades. Local kids dare each other to spend the night there, and most who try end up running home before dawn with stories of voices in the walls and shadows that move without light to cast them. I went inside. The cabin looks exactly like it does in my nightmares. Same wooden walls, same stone fireplace, same sense of something watching from the corners of rooms that seem larger inside than the exterior walls should allow. The symbols carved into the floor are still visible, worn smooth by decades of weather but unmistakably present. In the center of the main room, I found a circle of stones that wasn't mentioned in any police report. Smooth river rocks arranged in a pattern that made my eyes water to follow. Inside the circle, the wooden floor was stained dark with something that might have been blood. I knelt down and touched one of the stones. The vision hit me like a physical blow. Suddenly I was Nelson Remeyer, standing over John Blymeyer, his broken body, watching the old man, his lips move in a final curse. But this time I could understand the words he spoke, in a language that was older than English or German or any human tongue. He wasn't just cursing Nelson. He was binding our entire bloodline to his service, ensuring that every 7 years, a Remeyer would die and join the growing collection of souls trapped in whatever space exists between life and death. We would become his servants in whatever work he continued beyond the grave. But the vision showed me something else. The curse could be broken, but only by the last of the bloodline. Only by someone willing to make the same sacrifice John Blymeyer had made decades before his murder. I have to go back to that cabin on the anniversary of Nelson's death. Thanksgiving night, just like my great-grandfather did in 1928. But instead of committing murder, I have to offer myself willingly. Take Blymeyer, this place in whatever bargain he made with forces that existed before human civilization crawled out of caves. It's the only way to free the souls he has collected over the decades. The only way to end a cycle that has claimed too many innocent lives. 7 days from now, I'll drive back to Pennsylvania. I'll walk into that cabin and face whatever John Blymeyer has become after almost a century of death. Maybe I can break the curse that has haunted my family for 4 generations. Maybe I'll just become another victim in a pattern of supernatural vengeance that will continue long after I'm gone. But I have to try, because I started seeing him in my waking hours now. John Blymeyer, standing at the edge of my vision with his burned face and knowing smile. He is growing stronger as the anniversary approaches, feeding on the fear and guilt that has poisoned my bloodline for decades. And yesterday, I found symbols carved into my bedroom wall. The same patterns I saw in the cabin, appearing overnight while I slept. When I tried to sand them away, they just grew deeper, as if something was carving them from the inside of the house. Time is running out. If you, re-listening to this, if something happens to me in Pennsylvania, just remember that some curses are real. Some grudges survive death and grow stronger with each passing year. The Appalachian Mountains hold secrets that civilized people have forgotten, but those secrets remember us. They remember every slight, every betrayal, every act of violence committed in their shadow. And sometimes, they demand payment that spans generations. The Remeyer curse ends with me, one way or another, but I have a feeling John Blymeier's work is far from finished. Still with me? Good. Hit subscribe and the bell so the next whisper finds you first. Tell us in the comments where you're listening. Maybe your own woods aren't so different from these. Story 5. Thing that glows in Grafton. I should have never taken that job in West Virginia. But when you, re-42, divorced, and your construction company just went under, you get to be picky about work opportunities. The call came on a Tuesday. A voice I didn't recognize offered me 3 months of steady pay to survey old mining roads near Grafton, West Virginia. Something about updating county records for potential development. The money was too good to refuse. And honestly, I needed to get out of Ohio for a while. Clear my head, figure out what came next. That first drive into the mountains should have been a warning. Highway 50 cuts through some of the most isolated country you'll ever see. Miles of dense forest, broken only by rusted guardrails and the occasional abandoned gas station. The kind of place where your cell phone dies and stays dead. Where the trees grow so thick they block out the afternoon sun. I pulled into Grafton just as the light was fading. Population maybe 3,000 on a good day, though half the houses looked empty. Boarded windows, collapsed porches, yards grown wild with weeds. The kind of town that coal built and economics destroyed. The motel clerk, an elderly woman with nervous hands, seemed surprised to see me. She kept glancing at the parking lot while I filled out the registration card, like she expected someone to follow me inside. When I mentioned I'd be working near the Tigard River, her expression changed completely. That night, I made the mistake of researching the area online. That's when I first read about the Grafton monster. According to local reports dating back to 1964, witnesses had been seeing something near the river. Something large and pale that moved upright but had no head, just broad shoulders and long arms that seemed to glow in the darkness. I laughed it off. Every small town has its stories. Bigfoot, lake monsters, UFOs, local legends that bring in curious tourists and give teenagers something to talk about. I'd grown up hearing similar tales in rural Ohio. They were never real. The next morning, I started my survey work along the old mining access roads. These weren't marked on any GPS, just rutted dirt paths that snaked through the mountains, following routes carved out decades ago by men looking for coal. My job was to document which ones were still passable, which ones had washed out, and which ones led to potentially valuable timber or mineral rights. The forest was different here, older somehow. The trees grew massive and close together, creating a canopy so thick that even at noon, the light filtering through felt dim and green. Every sound seemed muffled, my footsteps on the leaf-covered ground, the distant call of birds. Even my own breathing felt too loud in the silence. By the third day, I noticed the first strange thing. No wildlife. In 42 years of hiking and camping, I'd never been in woods this quiet. No squirrels chattering, no deer tracks in the soft earth, no insects buzzing around my face. Just silence and the smell of damp leaves and something else I couldn't identify. Something sweet and rotten at the same time. That afternoon, I found the first mining camp, or what was left of it. 3 wooden structures, roofs collapsed, walls gray with age and weather. But someone had been there recently. Fresh tire tracks in the mud, empty beer cans that weren't rusted yet. A campfire ring with cold ashes. I was photographing the buildings when I found the bones. Not human bones, thankfully, but animal remains scattered in a rough circle around the largest structure. Deer, maybe a few smaller mammals, all picked completely clean, all arranged with an intentionality that made my skin crawl. That night, back at the motel, I called my contact about the survey work. A man named Davidson who claimed to represent the development company. The call went straight to voicemail. It had been going to voicemail since day one. Actually, I was starting to wonder if Davidson even existed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about those bones, about the perfect silence in the forest, about the way the motel clerk had looked at me when I mentioned the Tigard River. Around 3 a.m, I heard it, a sound like nothing I'd ever experienced before. Low and rumbling, but not quite animal. Not quite mechanical either. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the thin motel walls, through the bed frame, through my chest. I went to the window and pulled back the curtain. The parking lot was empty except for my truck. Beyond the chain-link fence, the forest was a wall of black. But there, at the tree line, something pale moved between the trunks. Something tall and broad that seemed to emit its own faint light. I watched for maybe 30 seconds before it vanished. When I tried to convince myself I imagined it, I realized my hands were shaking. The next morning, I decided to focus my survey work closer to the river. The Tigard River runs through Grafton like a brown ribbon, muddy with runoff from old mining operations upstream. The access roads here were in worse condition, some barely passable even with my four-wheel drive. I was about 2 miles from town when I found the second camp. This one was different, newer, a small trailer, generator still humming, propane tanks, and camping equipment that looked expensive. But no people. The trailer door hung open, and when I called out, nobody answered. Inside, the trailer was a mess. Clothes scattered on the floor, food left out on the counter, spoiled and covered with flies. A laptop computer sitting open on the small table, still running. When I looked at the screen, I found dozens of files. Photos, video clips, research notes. All about the Grafton monster. The photos were recent, taken with a telephoto lens, mostly at night using some kind of infrared camera. They showed a figure moving through the trees near the river. Tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Humanoid, but wrong somehow. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. And where the head should have been, there was just smooth, pale skin that seemed to glow with its own light. But the worst part was the dates on the files. They went back 6 months. Someone had been watching this thing, documenting it, for half a year. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago. I was reading through the research notes when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on gravel. I minimized the laptop screen and stepped to the trailer door, expecting to see the researcher returning. Instead, I found 3 men in dirty work clothes standing near my truck. They didn't look friendly. The largest one, a bearded man with arms like tree trunks, spat into the dirt when he saw me. The other 2 flanked him, hands resting on their belt buckles in a way that suggested they might be carrying something more than tools. The bearded man asked what I was doing on private property. I explained about the survey work, showed him my paperwork and equipment. He looked it over with eyes that didn't trust anything from outside the county. Finally, he handed it back and told me I should finish my work quickly and leave. Some places, he said, weren't meant to be disturbed. When they walked away, I noticed they headed not toward the road, but deeper into the forest, toward the river. That evening, I tried calling Davidson again. This time, a different voice answered. A woman who claimed to have never heard of any survey work in West Virginia. When I described the job, the contact information, the paperwork I'd been sent, she put me on hold. When she came back, her voice had changed. She told me there was no record of any development project in Grafton. No record of anyone named Davidson. No record of the company that had hired me. I hung up the phone and stared at the stack of official-looking documents on the motel room desk. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to get me to West Virginia. The question was why. Sleep was impossible that night. Every sound outside the window made me jump. A car door slamming, a dog barking in the distance, the hum of the ice machine down the hall. But underneath it all, I kept thinking I could hear that low, rumbling sound again. Like something large moving through the forest. Getting closer. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. Whatever was happening in Grafton, I didn't want any part of it. But when I went to start my truck, the engine turned over once and died. When I popped the hood, I found someone had cut several of the wires. Cut them clean, with intent. The motel clerk acted surprised when I told her about the vandalism. She offered to call a mechanic, but warned me it might be a few days before parts could be delivered. In the meantime, she said, I was welcome to stay. No charge for the extra nights. Her kindness felt genuine, but there was something else in her eyes. Relief, maybe, like she'd been expecting this. With nowhere else to go, I decided to hike back to the river. If I was stuck in Grafton, I might as well finish what I started. But this time, I brought a camera of my own. The abandoned trailer was still there, generator still humming, but someone had been through it. The laptop was gone, the research files, the photos, everything related to the monster sightings had vanished. Only personal belongings remained. I spent the afternoon exploring the mining roads that followed the river. The silence in the forest was even more pronounced now, if that was possible. Not just the absence of animal sounds, but something deeper, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. As the sun began to set, I found myself at the end of a particularly overgrown trail. The path opened onto a clearing beside the river, and in the center of that clearing stood something that made no sense. It was a structure of some kind, maybe 12 feet tall and roughly circular, made entirely of bones, animal bones, arranged in intricate patterns and held together with what looked like dried mud or clay. At the top, a skull I didn't recognize. Too large to be human, too shaped to be any animal I knew. The smell here was overwhelming. That sweet, rotten scent I'd been noticing all week, but concentrated now to the point where it made my eyes water. I raised my camera to document the structure, but before I could take a photo, I heard something behind me. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the undergrowth with purpose. I turned around slowly, and there it was, the Grafton monster, standing maybe 30 feet away, at the edge of the tree line. It was exactly as the photos had shown, but seeing it in person was completely different. The size was overwhelming, 7.5 feet tall at least, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it did glow. Not brightly, but with a soft luminescence that seemed to pulse with its breathing. But the most disturbing thing was where its head should have been. The shoulders simply curved upward into smooth, featureless skin. No face, no eyes, no mouth. Just blank, glowing flesh that somehow conveyed an intelligence that was watching me. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Neither of us moving. Me with my camera half raised, it with its impossibly long arms hanging at its sides. In that moment, I understood why the forest was so quiet. This thing was an apex predator. Everything else had learned to hide when it was near. Then it began to move, not toward me, but in a slow circle around the clearing. Its movements were fluid, almost graceful despite its size. With each step, the glow seemed to intensify slightly, and I could feel that rumbling sound again. Not heard, but felt, vibrating through the ground, through my bones. I realized it was communicating, not with words, but with something deeper. And somehow, impossibly, I understood what it was telling me. The bone structure wasn't random. It was a warning, a marker. This clearing, this stretch of the river, was claimed territory. Had been for decades. The missing researcher whose trailer I found hadn't left willingly. Neither had the others who had come before him. The creature completed its circle and stopped directly between me and the path back to town. Its meaning was clear. I'd seen too much, knew too much. I wouldn't be leaving. But then, something unexpected happened. The sound of engines in the distance. Multiple vehicles, moving fast along the mining road. The creature, its head turned toward the sound, or rather, the smooth area where its head should have been oriented in that direction. In that moment of distraction, I ran. Not toward the path, but straight into the river. The water was shockingly cold and deeper than it looked. The current was stronger too, pulling me downstream faster than I could swim toward the far bank. Behind me, I heard shouting. Human voices, angry and urgent. Then the crack of gunfire. Multiple shots echoing off the mountains. I went under, let the current carry me, came up gasping 50 yards downstream. When I finally made it to the opposite bank, I looked back toward the clearing. Flashlight beams were moving through the trees. I could hear men calling to each other, but I couldn't make out the words. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to be part of it. I spent that night hiding in an abandoned hunting cabin I found about a mile downstream. Cold, wet, and terrified. When morning came, I hiked back toward town using logging roads I mapped during my survey work. My truck had been repaired. The motel clerk handed me the keys without a word, but her nervous energy was gone. She seemed almost relieved to see me. I packed quickly and drove out of Grafton without looking back. It wasn't until I was back in Ohio that I learned what had happened that night. A small item in the Charleston Gazette mentioned a fire near the Tygart River. An abandoned research station had burned completely, along with several acres of forest. No casualties were reported, but investigators found evidence of illegal hunting activity. Several men from the area had been arrested. I never did find out who really hired me for that survey work. The company address led to an empty office building. The phone numbers were disconnected. It was like the whole thing had been designed to get me to Grafton at exactly the right time. But I think I understand now. The Grafton monster had been there for decades, maybe longer. Staying hidden, marking its territory, avoiding human contact when possible. But development pressure was increasing. Outsiders were coming more frequently. Researchers, hunters, curiosity seekers drawn by the legends. Someone local had decided the situation needed to be managed. The bone structure I found wasn't built by the creature. It was built by the men who had been protecting it. The same men who confronted me at the trailer. Who disabled my truck. Who made sure I was in exactly the right place when they dealt with the researcher who had gotten too close. I was supposed to be a witness. Someone from outside who could testify that there was nothing unusual in those woods. That the legends were just stories. That any evidence to the contrary had been destroyed in an unfortunate fire. But I'd seen too much. And now, 6 months later, I'm still seeing it. Every time I close my eyes, I see that smooth, glowing skin where a face should have been. I feel that rumbling communication that bypass language entirely. I understand that some things are meant to stay hidden in the deep places of the world. The worst part is the dreams. Because in the dreams, I'm not running away from the creature. I'm walking toward it. And it is not standing in the clearing anymore. It is standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with eyes it doesn't have, waiting for me to come back to Grafton. Story 6. Devil is Highway. I never believed in ghost stories until that black truck tried to kill me on Route 40. It happened 3 weeks ago, but I still wake up at night hearing the sound of rusted metal scraping against asphalt. Still see that single headlight burning through my rearview mirror like the eye of something hungry and patient. I was driving back from a job interview in Cumberland, Maryland. 41 years old, recently laid off from the steel plant, and desperate enough to consider relocating for work. The interview had gone poorly. Another dead end in a string of rejections that had been eating away at my savings and my pride for 6 months. Route 40 cuts through the Appalachian Mountains like a scar. They call it the Devil's Highway for good reason. Sharp curves that drop off into nothing. Fog that rolls in without warning. And at night, when the truckers and commuters have gone home, it becomes something else entirely. Something that feels forgotten by the modern world. I should have taken Interstate 68, the safe route. But fuel was expensive, and Route 40 would save me 20 miles. 20 miles that might as well have been 20 years, considering what I found waiting for me in those mountains. The sun was setting as I crossed into the national forest. Orange light filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across the 2-lane road. I had maybe an hour of daylight left, and the radio had started crackling with static. Cell service had died 10 miles back. That's when I first saw it in my mirror. A black pickup truck, maybe 3 car lengths behind me. Old model, probably from the 80s. The kind of truck you see rusting in farmyards. Too beat up to drive, but too sentimental to scrap. At first, I didn't think much of it. Rural roads attract old vehicles. Farmers, hunters, locals who know every curve and pothole by heart. But something about this truck felt wrong. It sat too low on its axles, like it was carrying a heavy load. And it only had one working headlight. I slowed down to let it pass. The truck slowed down too. I sped up. So did the truck. For 5 miles, it maintained exactly the same distance behind me, matching my speed with mechanical precision. The sun disappeared completely. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating nothing but asphalt and the occasional reflector post. In my rearview mirror, that single headlight burned like a distant star. Unwavering, patient. I tried the radio again. Nothing but static and the occasional fragment of talk radio from stations too far away to understand. The silence felt oppressive, like the mountains themselves were listening. That's when I noticed the smell. Even with my windows up and the heat running, I could detect something seeping into the car. Something metallic and sweet, like blood mixed with motor oil. The truck was getting closer. Not gradually, but in sudden jumps. 1 second it was 3 car lengths back. The next it was 2. Then 1. I could see it clearly now in my mirror. Rust had eaten through the hood and fenders. The windshield was spider-webbed with cracks, and where the driver should have been, there was only shadow. I pressed harder on the accelerator. My car wasn't built for mountain driving, but fear has a way of finding extra horsepower. The speedometer climbed past 50, then 60. The curves were getting sharper, the drop-off steeper, but I didn't care. I just needed to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. The truck kept pace effortlessly. No matter how fast I drove, that headlight stayed locked in my mirror. And now I could hear it, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the engine, the exhaust, and something else. Something that sounded almost like breathing. I came around a sharp curve and saw taillights ahead. Another car, moving slowly up the grade. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't alone on the road anymore. Whatever game the truck was playing, it would have to stop now. But as I approached the other car, something was wrong. The taillights were dim, flickering. The car itself seemed to shimmer in my headlights, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. As I got closer, I could see through it, through the metal, through the seats, through the driver. I drove right through it, felt nothing, heard nothing, just the sensation of passing through cold air and shadows. In my mirror, the phantom car was gone, but the black truck remained. Now I understood. Route 40 wasn't just dangerous because of bad curves and steep grades. It was dangerous because it collected things. Cars that had crashed, drivers who had died, all of them trapped on an endless loop of asphalt that wound through mountains that were older than memory. The truck was getting aggressive. I could hear it now without looking in the mirror. The sound of grinding gears and metal scraping against stone. It was close enough that I could smell exhaust fumes and something else. Something organic and rotten. I took the next curve too fast. My tires screamed against the asphalt, and for a moment I thought I was going over the edge. But I held the road, barely, and straightened out on a long downhill stretch. The truck fell back slightly, and I allowed myself to hope. That's when I saw the roadblock ahead. Orange construction barriers stretched across both lanes. Warning signs and flashing lights. A dead end with nowhere to turn around and a 100-foot drop on both sides. I slammed on the brakes, but I was going too fast. The barriers rushed toward me like an orange wall. At the last second, I saw the gap. A narrow space between two barriers, just wide enough for a car. I yanked the wheel hard right and squeezed through, scraping paint off both sides of my car but making it through intact. In my mirror, the truck hit the barriers at full speed. Metal screamed against metal. Sparks flew in all directions. But instead of stopping, the truck passed right through the barriers like they weren't there. Like it existed in a different reality where physical laws didn't apply. The road ahead was wrong. This wasn't Route 40 anymore. The asphalt was older, cracked, with weeds growing through the gaps. The guardrails were made of wood instead of metal, and the trees pressed closer to the road, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the stars. I was driving through the old highway, the original Route 40 that had been abandoned decades ago when they built the modern road, the one that had claimed so many lives that they had finally given up trying to maintain it. Behind me, the truck was gaining again. Its single headlight filled my entire rearview mirror now, washing out everything else. I could hear its engine, loud as thunder, and underneath that sound was something that might have been laughter. Or screaming. It was impossible to tell which. The speedometer read 70, then 80. My car was shaking apart on the broken pavement, but I kept my foot pressed to the floor. Trees flashed by in a green blur. The yellow center line had faded to nothing. I was driving by instinct and terror, hoping the road would hold together long enough for me to find a way out. That is when I saw them. Other cars, parked along the roadside. Dozens of them. Cars from every decade since the road had been built. A Model T Ford with its brass headlights still gleaming. A 50s Buick with tail fins and chrome. A 70s muscle car with racing stripes. All of them empty. All of them waiting. The truck was right behind me now. Close enough that its headlight turned my car, its interior white as bone. I could feel heat radiating from its engine. Could hear the squeal of brakes that would never work. In my side mirror, I caught a glimpse of the driver. There was no driver, just empty space behind a steering wheel that turned by itself. Empty space that somehow conveyed malevolence and hunger and endless, patient rage. The truck nudged my bumper. A gentle tap that set my car lurching forward. Then another, harder this time. I could hear metal crumpling, feel my rear axle starting to bend. The truck was toying with me, herding me toward some predetermined destination. Ahead, the road curved sharply to the left. Beyond the curve, nothing but empty air and a drop that disappeared into darkness. The truck gave me one final push, and suddenly I was airborne, flying through space with nothing but night and the distant lights of the valley floor below. But I didn't hit the ground. Instead, I felt the car settle gently onto pavement again. Real pavement, modern Route 40 with proper guardrails and reflector posts. I was back on the main highway, somehow transported from the ghost road to the world of the living. In my mirror, the black truck was gone. No headlight, no engine noise, just the empty road stretching back into the mountains. I pulled over at the first rest stop I found and sat there until sunrise, shaking too hard to drive. When I got home, I researched everything I could find about Route 40. The accident reports went back to the 1920s. Dozens of crashes on that same stretch of road. Cars found mangled at the bottom of ravines. Drivers never found at all. And in almost every report, witnesses mentioned the same thing. A black pickup truck with one headlight, seen just before the crash. The truck was collecting drivers. Had been for decades, feeding off the fear and desperation of people traveling that lonely stretch of road. People like me, people with nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. I never took Route 40 again. Started driving the interstate exclusively, even though it cost more in gas. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself looking in the rearview mirror, waiting for that single headlight to appear. Because I know the truth now, the black truck isn't confined to Route 40. It's everywhere dark roads intersect with human desperation, hunting for drivers who lost their way, literally or figuratively. Drivers who might not be missed if they disappeared. Last week, I got another job interview. This one in West Virginia, down a back road that isn't on any GPS. The interviewer insisted on meeting after dark. Said it was the only time that worked with his schedule. The pay is good. Too good, maybe. But I've been going anyway. Because I've been unemployed for 8 months now, and my savings are almost gone. Because I need this job, even if it means driving dark mountain roads at night. Even if it means watching my mirrors and listening for the sound of an engine that shouldn't exist. I keep telling myself it won't happen again. That lightning doesn't strike twice. But deep down, I know the truth. The black truck is still out there, waiting on some forgotten stretch of highway. Waiting for drivers who have nowhere else to turn. Waiting for me to run out of choices and find myself alone on a dark road with nothing but my headlights and my fear. And when that happens, I'll see that single light in my mirror again. I'll hear the sound of rusted metal scraping against asphalt. And I'll know that this time, there won't be any escape. This time, I'll join the others parked along the ghost road. Empty cars waiting for drivers who will never come home. Story 7. Bones in the cellar. I found the first skeleton on a Tuesday morning while installing new water pipes beneath the Hartwell farmhouse. The skull was pressed against the basement wall like it had been trying to claw its way out through solid stone. Small fractures spider-webbed across the bone, and the jaw hung open in what looked like a silent scream. Around it, scattered ribs and finger bones emerged from the dirt floor like pieces of some horrible puzzle. I'd been renovating old houses in rural West Virginia for 15 years, but I'd never seen anything like this. The bones were old, stained brown with age and decay, but they were human. No doubt about it, and they weren't alone. As I scraped away more dirt, I found another skull, then another. By noon, I uncovered parts of at least 6 different skeletons, all buried in shallow graves beneath what had once been the Hartwell family home. The house had been abandoned for 20 years, sitting empty on 40 acres of mountain land that nobody wanted to buy. The current owner, a distant relative from Pittsburgh, had hired me to renovate it into rental property. Turn it into something that could generate income instead of property taxes and bad memories. But the locals had warned me about the place, about the family that had lived there for over a century, about the bad blood that ran in the Hartwell line, about things that happened in that house that decent people didn't talk about in mixed company. I should have listened to those warnings. The Hartwells had been in those mountains since the 1890s. Pioneer stock, supposedly hard-working farmers who kept to themselves and minded their own business. But there were stories, whispers about family members who disappeared without explanation, about screams that carried across the valley on quiet nights, about why no Hartwell child ever seemed to make it past adolescence. The neighbors knew something was wrong, but proving it was different than knowing it. The Hartwells owned their land outright, miles from the nearest town. What happened on their property was their business, even when that business involved things that would make normal people sick to think about. I called the state police from my truck, hands still shaking from what I found in that basement. Told them about the bones, about the shallow graves, about the need for a forensic team and probably a coroner. The dispatcher sounded skeptical until I sent photos from my phone. Then her tone changed completely. The investigation took 3 days. Teams from the state medical examiner's office, forensic anthropologists from the university, crime scene technicians who they'd driven down from Charleston. They found 17 complete skeletons and partial remains from at least 6 more individuals, all buried beneath the house, all showing signs of malnutrition and abuse, all between the ages of 12 and 16. The coroner estimated the oldest remains had been in the ground for nearly a century. The newest were maybe 20 years old, which matched when the last Hartwells had left the property. 23 young people, buried in unmarked graves beneath a farmhouse that had been home to 5 generations of the same family. But the forensic team found more than just bones. They found chains, rusted metal restraints bolted to the basement walls, a series of small rooms that had been walled off from the main cellar, each one just large enough for a person to lie down. No windows, no ventilation, no way to escape once the door was locked from the outside. The Hartwells they'd just been killing children. They'd been keeping them, imprisoning them beneath their house like animals in cages, feeding them just enough to keep them alive, using them for purposes that the forensic evidence suggested but that I don't want to describe in detail. And it had been going on for generations. The state police interviewed everyone in the county who had memories of the Hartwell family, pieced together a timeline that went back to the 1920s, when old Samuel Hartwell had first started taking in orphans and runaways. Kids with no families to report them missing. No one to ask questions when they disappeared. The neighbors had suspected something, but the Hartwells were careful. Never took local children, never took more than one at a time. Always waited years between victims, long enough for people to forget about the previous one. And they chose their targets carefully. Street kids from the cities, migrant workers, children who wouldn't be missed. By the 1950s, it had become a family tradition. Samuel passed his methods down to his sons, who passed them down to their sons. Each generation learned how to select victims, how to keep them hidden, how to dispose of the bodies when they were finished with them. The basement became a generational killing ground, a place where unspeakable things happened while the neighbors went about their normal lives just a few miles away, never knowing that children were screaming for help beneath the floorboards of the old Hartwell place. But something changed in the 1990s. The last generation of Hartwells, 2 brothers named Wade and Curtis, started making mistakes, taking risks that their ancestors never would have taken. Maybe the isolation had finally driven them completely insane, or maybe they just got careless after decades of never being caught. They took a local girl, 16-year-old Sarah Mills from the town of Beckley, who had run away from an abusive stepfather and was hitchhiking toward Virginia when the brothers picked her up. Sarah had friends who knew her plans, people who reported her missing when she didn't, to arrive at her destination. The search for Sarah Mills brought state police and FBI agents into the mountains for the first time in decades. Brought attention to the Hartwell property that the family had always been able to avoid. And brought questions that the brothers couldn't answer without revealing their family, this century-long secret. So they ran, abandoned the house in the middle of the night and disappeared into the larger world, leaving behind evidence of crimes that spanned 5 generations. Sarah Mills was never found, but the investigation uncovered enough circumstantial evidence to convince the authorities that she met the same fate as all the others. By then, it was too late for prosecution. Wade Hartwell died of cancer in Florida in 2003. Curtis Hartwell was killed in a car accident in Texas 2 years later. The last of the bloodline, taking their secrets to the grave and leaving behind only the bones beneath the house to tell their story. But those bones told a story that went beyond simple murder. The forensic evidence suggested systematic torture, prolonged imprisonment, and medical experiments that had no purpose except cruelty. The Hartwells hadn't just been killing children. They'd been studying them, learning from them, perfecting techniques that had been passed down from father to son like some horrible family craft. The basement had been designed for this purpose, built with soundproof walls and hidden entrances, equipped with medical tools and restraint devices that showed decades of use and refinement. This wasn't the work of a single disturbed individual. This was institutional evil, practiced and perfected by multiple generations of the same family. And the neighbors had known. Maybe not the specific details, but they known something was wrong. The whispers about bad blood in the Hartwell line weren't just gossip. They were warnings passed down through generations of mountain families who had learned to recognize the signs of predation and evil. But knowing and proving are different things. And in a place where privacy is valued above almost everything else, where what happens on a man, his property is his business and nobody else, it's easy for monsters to hide in plain sight for decades. I finished the renovation work after the investigation was complete. The state had removed all the remains, sealed off the basement, and declared the property safe for habitation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the evil in that house went deeper than just buried bones. The floorboards creaked in patterns that sounded almost like footsteps. The walls seemed to hold echoes of screams that had been silenced decades ago. And at night, when the mountain wind blew through the trees, I could swear I heard voices calling from beneath the house. Young voices pleading for help that would never come. The rental property never found tenants. Word had spread through the county about what had been found beneath the Hartwell house, and no amount of renovation could wash away that kind of stain. The place sat empty again, slowly falling back into the decay and neglect that had claimed it after the last Hartwells fled. But sometimes, late at night, I'd drive past the old farmhouse on my way home from other jobs. And sometimes, I see lights in the windows. Soft, flickering lights that could be candles or flashlights. Movement in the rooms that I know are empty. I tell myself it's just vandals, teenagers looking for thrills in a house with a dark reputation, urban explorers drawn by the macabre history of the place. But deep down, I know this is something else. The Hartwell house collected more than just bones over the years. It collected pain and fear and desperation. It absorbed the last moments of 23 young lives, and that kind of energy doesn't just disappear when the bodies are removed. Sometimes I wonder if those lights in the windows are the spirits of the victims, still trapped in the place where they died. Still trying to escape from rooms that have no exits, still calling for help that will never come. Still reliving the worst moments of their short lives in an endless cycle of horror and despair. Or maybe the lights belong to something else. Maybe the evil that the Hartwells practiced for a century left something behind. Something that feeds on the memory of what happened in that basement. Something that keeps the house alive with malevolence and waiting for the next family to move in and continue the tradition. I don't know which possibility scares me more. What I do know is that some places absorb so much evil that they become evil themselves. Some houses hold on to darkness like a stain that can never be washed clean. And some family secrets are so terrible that they poison the ground where they reburied, turning peaceful farmland into something that decent people instinctively avoid. The Hartwell farmhouse still stands on those 40 acres of mountain land. Still sits empty and deteriorating, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that surrounds it. Still holds the memory of things that should never have happened, in rooms that echo with the voices of children who died too young and too far from home. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, you can still hear them calling. Still pleading for someone to find them, to save them, to bring them home to families that never stop looking for them. But it's too late for rescue now. Too late for everything except remembrance and the hope that the Hartwell name dies with the house, and that no one else ever learns the techniques that were passed down through 5 generations of monsters who looked like ordinary mountain farmers. The bones are gone now, given proper burial in marked graves with headstones that bear their names when those names could be determined. But the house remains, and with it, the memory of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when they think no one is watching. Some secrets are too terrible to stay buried. Some houses hold too much darkness to ever be clean again. And some family legacies are so evil that they contaminate the very ground where they took root. The Hartwell house is all of these things. A monument to generational evil. A reminder that monsters often wear familiar faces and live in ordinary places. A warning that the worst horrors are often the ones that happen behind closed doors. In basements where screams can to be heard. In families where bad blood runs so deep that children become prey and tradition becomes an excuse for unspeakable cruelty. I drive a different road home now. Story 8. Last call from the fire tower. I never believed in ghosts until I heard the recording. The one they tried to bury. The one that proves Thomas Hartwell is still watching from that fire tower, even though he burned alive 15 years ago. My name is Jake Morrison, and I work for the National Forest Service in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I have the evidence. Audio files they classified, reports they sealed, and a burned man who saves lives from beyond the grave. It started when I took over Hartwell, was old territory. Sector 7 covers 30,000 acres of dense Appalachian forest, monitored from Fire Tower 19. The rebuilt tower, they never mentioned what happened to the original. Thomas Hartwell was a legend among fire rangers. 23 years of service, never lost a life on his watch. He knew these mountains like his own backyard, could smell smoke from 20 miles away, predict wind patterns that would fool meteorologists. Everyone said the forest spoke to him. October 12, 2009 changed everything. The Piedmont fire started small, like they always do. Lightning strike near Miller Creek. Hartwell spotted it from the tower at 0600 hours, called it in immediately. Standard procedure, the response team deployed, expected to contain it by noon. But this fire had other plans. Within 3 hours, it had jumped 2 ridgelines and consumed 800 acres. The wind shifted without warning, pushing flames toward the evacuated town of Millbrook. Hartwell stayed at his post, coordinating aerial drops and ground crews, his calm voice guiding firefighters through smoke so thick they couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Then something went wrong, catastrophically wrong. At 14:37 hours, Hartwell made his final transmission. The recording was classified immediately, locked away in federal archives. I shouldn't have access to it, but my supervisor, Bill Hendricks, smuggled me a copy before he retired. Said I needed to understand what I was walking into. But listened to it 1,000 times. It still gives me nightmares. Hartwell's voice comes through clear at first, professional and controlled. Base, this is Tower 19. I am seeing something unusual here. The fire. It's moving wrong. Dispatch responds. Routine and bored. Tower 19, clarify. Moving wrong. The flames are advancing against the wind. That's impossible, but I'm watching it happen. The fire line is... It's like a wall. A solid wall of flame, moving in a straight line toward town. This ISN to natural fire behavior. You can hear the confusion in his voice. Then something else. Fear. Base, I need immediate evacuation of Millbrook. This fire is moving at 30 miles per hour. 30 miles per hour? Do you copy? No wildfire moves that fast. The radio crackles. Dead air. Then Hartwell's voice returns. But it is different now. Higher pitched, panicked. My God, there are shapes in the flames. Human shapes. They walking through the fire? How is that possible? Base, are you receiving this? More static. When his voice comes back, he is whispering. They looking at me. The burning figures. They looking directly at me through the fire. They want something. They pointing toward town. The audio cuts out for 17 seconds. When it returns, Hartwell is screaming. The fire is climbing. It is climbing straight up the mountain. No wind, no fuel ladder, but it is coming for the tower. Base, if anyone can hear this, evacuate Millbrook now. The fire ISN, T-natural. It's being controlled. It's being... The transmission ends with a sound I'll never forget. Not screaming, laughter. Thomas Hartwell was laughing as he burned alive. The official report stated that Hartwell suffered smoke inhalation, became delirious, and died when the tower was engulfed. The fire was contained 3 days later after consuming 12,000 acres. Millbrook was saved, barely, but the survivors remember Hartwell's warnings, how he directed them to safety roads before the flames arrived, how his voice came through their emergency radios even after the tower had burned down. They rebuilt Tower 19 exactly where the old one stood. Same height, same design. That is where they stationed me. My first month was quiet. Routine patrols, weather reports, the occasional hiker rescue. I told myself the stories about Hartwell were just mountain folklore. Grief manifested as ghost tales. Then came the night I saw him. It was past midnight when movement outside caught my eye. A figure standing on the observation deck. Impossible, since I was alone in the tower and had locked the door myself. I grabbed my flashlight and crept outside. The deck was empty, but the metal railing was warm. Hot, actually, as if someone with a fever had been gripping it for hours. The next morning, I found burned handprints on the railing. Perfect impressions of fingers, seared into the steel. I reported it to Hendricks, expecting him to suggest psychological evaluation. Instead, he nodded grimly and told me about the others. 7 rangers who worked Tower 19 since the rebuild. All reported similar encounters. All transferred out within 6 months. Hartwell is still on duty, Hendricks said. Still protecting these mountains. But he is not exactly human anymore. That is when he gave me the classified recording and told me the real story. The Piedmont fire wasn't natural. It was arson, but not the kind you'd expect. Local authorities found evidence of accelerants, but not gasoline or diesel. Something else, something that burned hotter than any chemical should, left residue that glowed in the dark for weeks. The shapes Hartwell saw in the flames weren't hallucinations. They were caught on satellite imagery, thermal signatures walking through 1200-degree fire without being consumed. The images were classified, but Hendricks had seen them. Humanoid figures made of living flame, directing the fire as path-like conductors leading an orchestra. Who were they? I asked. That was classified above my level. Hendricks replied. But I have theories. This isn't the first time something like this happened in these mountains. Cherokee legends speak of fire spirits, angry souls who died in flames. Maybe someone was trying to wake them up. I wanted to believe it was nonsense, but the evidence kept mounting. My second month at the tower, I started hearing radio transmissions that weren't officially logged. Hartwell, his voice clear as day, reporting fire hazards that ground crews would find exactly where he said they'd be. Weather updates that proved more accurate than the National Weather Service. Warnings about dangerous wind conditions that saved aerial firefighting teams from catastrophic accidents. The other rangers knew about it. They get calls on emergency frequencies. Hartwell's voice guiding them away from danger zones, toward trapped hikers, around unstable terrain. But the transmissions never appeared on official recordings. Only the rangers could hear him. It was like he'd become part of the forest itself, a guardian spirit made of smoke and flame. Then came the night everything changed. I was monitoring a small grass fire near Breakneck Ridge when my radio exploded with static. Through the interference came Hartwell's voice, more urgent than I ever heard it. Tower 19, this is Ranger Hartwell. Code red emergency. They back. My blood turned cold. Who is back? The fire spirits. They returning for unfinished business. Evacuate Millbrook immediately. They were going to try again. I checked the weather reports, fire danger levels, everything. No threat indicators. The small grass fire was contained. Barely an acre burned. Hartwell, I don't see any fire activity that would threaten the town. You're not looking in the right place. Check thermal satellite feeds, southwest of Miller Creek, where it started last time. They regathering. I pulled up the satellite data on my computer. At first, nothing unusual. Then I adjusted the thermal settings and saw them. Heat signatures, dozens of them. Human-shaped thermal blooms moving through the forest, each one registering temperatures over 800 degrees. They were converging on Miller Creek, exactly where the Piedmont fire had started 15 years ago. I called it in to dispatch immediately. This is Tower 19, requesting immediate aerial reconnaissance of the Miller Creek area. Possible fire activity. Tower 19, we show no fire reports in that sector. Trust me on this one. Send a helicopter. 20 minutes later, the helicopter pilot's voice came through, shaky and confused. Tower 19, I am over Miller Creek. No visible fire, but my thermal equipment is going crazy. Reading multiple heat sources, but I can't see anything with the naked eye. It's like the air itself is burning. That is when I understood. The fire spirits weren't just starting fires. They were the fire, living flame seeking revenge against the world of flesh and wood. Hartwell, his voice cut through the radio static again. Morrison, you need to evacuate the town. Now, they were not going to make the same mistake twice. What mistake? Last time, they underestimated me. Thought a human ranger couldn't stop them? But I did. I called in the evacuation. Saved those people. So they killed me for it. How do I stop them? You don't. But I can. They've been preparing for this. The temperature inside the tower began to rise. Not gradually, but instantly, like someone had opened an oven door. The metal walls started to glow cherry red. Through the smoke-stained windows, I saw him clearly for the first time. Thomas Hartwell stood on the observation deck, but he wasn't exactly human anymore. His ranger uniform was charred black, his skin the color of cooling embers. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were flames. Literal flames burning in empty sockets. He raised one burned hand to the glass, and his voice came through the radio one final time. Tell them I said goodbye, and tell them the mountains are safe. The tower erupted in light, not fire, but pure light, white and searing. When my vision returned, Hartwell was gone, and the night sky was filled with screams. Not human screams, the sound of flame itself being extinguished against its will. The thermal satellites recorded what happened next. The heat signatures at Miller Creek simply vanished, as if they'd been snuffed out by a cosmic wind. The grass fire went out. Even the pilot, his cigarette lighter, stopped working. In a 30-mile radius around Tower 19, every flame died simultaneously. The official report blamed equipment malfunction for the thermal readings. The helicopter pilot was quietly reassigned. I was commended for calling in a false alarm that somehow prevented a real emergency. But I know the truth. Thomas Hartwell is still out there, still on duty, still protecting these mountains from forces we don. Do you understand? The other rangers know it too. They started leaving coffee and sandwiches on the tower, this observation deck. The food disappears by morning, and in its place, they find reports written in ash. Fire hazard assessments, weather predictions, location coordinates for lost hikers. Always accurate, always life-saving. I've been at Tower 19 for 2 years now. They heard Hartwell's voice dozens of times, guiding me away from danger toward people who need help. Sometimes I see his shadow moving through the trees below, checking burn sites, maintaining fire breaks that no living person could access. Last month, a family of tourists got lost during a sudden storm. Their GPS failed, cell phones dead, temperature dropping toward hypothermia. I was about to organize a search and rescue when my radio crackled to life. Tower 19, this is Ranger Hartwell. Lost family at coordinates 37.426 north, 78.897 west. Direct rescue team to the old logging road. They hypothermic but stable. The family was found exactly where he said they'd be, huddled in a natural shelter they swore hadn't been there when they first passed through the area. The shelter was warm inside, as if heated by an invisible fire. The children said a kind man in a ranger uniform had shown them the shelter and told them help was coming. A man who smelled like campfire smoke and whose eyes reflected light like a cat. I never doubt Hartwell's calls anymore. When that radio crackles and his voice comes through, I listen. Because somewhere in these mountains, a dead man is still saving lives, still standing watch, still keeping his promise to protect the forest and everyone in it. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would happen if those fire spirits came back with reinforcements. If they brought something Hartwell couldn't handle alone. That's when I remember his laughter in that final transmission. Not the laugh of a man going insane, but the laugh of someone who figured out a terrible joke. Someone who realized the punchline was worth dying for. Thomas Hartwell didn't just die in that fire. He became something more, something necessary, something that stands between us and the things that burn in the spaces between worlds. And as long as he is out there, watching from the tower that killed him, the mountains are safe. Even if the rest of us never will be. Story 9. Disappearance on the devil. This backbone. I should have never driven the devil. This backbone alone at October 9. But when your ex-wife texts you at 11 p.m. saying your daughter is in the hospital 3 counties over, you don't think about cursed mountain roads or missing person statistics. You just drive. The devil's backbone cuts through the heart of the Appalachian Mountains like a scar across God's knuckles. 37 miles of switchbacks and hairpin turns carved into rock faces that have been watching travelers die for generations. The locals warned me at the gas station in Melfield. The old man behind the counter with fingers stained yellow from decades of cigarettes looked at my Pennsylvania plates and shook his head. "Road's been hungry this year," he said, not looking up from counting 20s. "Already took 2 souls since spring. Usually it's just 1. I thought he was talking about accidents. Fatal crashes. Statistics. The kind of thing that happens when you mix mountain curves with drunk drivers or texting teenagers. I didn't know about the other thing. The thing that makes the road itself choose who lives and who feeds its appetite. My headlights carved through fog thick as cotton as I climbed toward the first ridge. The radio crackled with static from all the metal in these ancient hills, catching fragments of country songs and emergency broadcasts before dissolving into white noise. I switched it off. The silence felt heavier than the static. Mile marker 7. That's when I first saw her. A woman stood on the shoulder ahead, thumb extended in the universal gesture of need. She wore a yellow rain slicker despite the clear night, and her long dark hair hung limp around her shoulders. As my headlights swept over her, she turned toward me with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Every rational part of my brain screamed not to stop. Not here. Not on a road where people vanish like morning mist. But she looked so desperate, so lost, that my foot moved to the brake before I could stop myself. I pulled over 20 feet past her, hands trembling as I shifted into park. Through my rearview mirror, I watched her approach with measured steps that made no sound on the gravel. She moved wrong, too smooth, like she was gliding instead of walking. She stopped at my passenger window and tapped once with a fingernail that scraped against the glass like chalk on a blackboard. When I looked directly at her face, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Her skin was pale as moonlight, stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular. But it was her smile that made my stomach clench with primal fear. Too wide, too many teeth that gleamed white and pointed in the darkness. Going my way? She asked through the glass. And her voice sounded like wind through dead leaves. I should have floored the accelerator. Should have left her standing there in my dust and taillights. Instead, I found myself reaching for the door lock, my hand moving independently of my will. The click sounded loud as a gunshot in the silent car. She slid into the passenger seat with fluid grace, bringing with her the smell of wet earth and something else. Something rotten and sweet, like flowers left too long on a grave. Her rain slicker squeaked against the leather seat as she settled in and turned to face me with that impossible smile. "Thank you," she said. "I've been waiting so long for a ride." I tried to speak, to ask where she was going, but my throat had closed up like a fist. She noticed my struggle and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't worry about talking," she said, reaching over to pat my thigh with fingers cold as winter stone. "Just drive. I'll tell you when to stop." My hands gripped the steering wheel as I pulled back onto the devil's backbone. The road ahead seemed to stretch longer than it should have, as if the miles were multiplying in the darkness. The yellow center line wavered in my vision like a snake. "You know about this road, Dawn, do you?" she asked conversationally, like we were old friends catching up. "About what it requires?" I managed to shake my head, not trusting my voice. "1 soul per year," she continued, staring out the windshield at the approaching curves. "That's the price for safe passage for everyone else. The road chooses carefully, usually someone alone, usually someone with nowhere else to go." Mile marker 15. The fog grew thicker, pressing against the windows like searching fingers. My speedometer read 40, but it felt like we were crawling through molasses. The woman beside me began humming a tune I didn't recognize, something old and mournful that made my teeth ache. "But this year has been different," she said, her humming stopping abruptly. "This year, the road is still hungry. 2 souls weren't enough. It needs more." I tried to press the brake, to slow down, to stop this nightmare ride, but my foot wouldn't respond. My body was no longer mine to control. The car continued its steady pace through the fog while something else drove my limbs like a puppet master pulling strings. "I used to be like you," she said, turning to look at me with those terrible eyes. "Driving through these mountains to get somewhere else. Somewhere important. Somewhere that mattered more than legends and warnings from old men in gas stations." Mile marker 23. Halfway through the devil's backbone. My daughter's face flashed in my mind. Her smile when she was 7 and still believed her daddy could protect her from anything. The hospital seemed impossibly far away now, like a destination from another life. "The road took me in 1987, the woman continued. October 13th. I was driving home from my sister's wedding in Charleston. My car went over the guardrail at Devil's Curve, down into the ravine where no one would find it until spring thaw. She leaned closer, and I could see that her yellow rain slicker was torn and stained with something dark. Something that had been there for 36 years. "But the road doesn't just take," she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. "It gives back. It makes us part of itself. We become the warning, the choice, the test." Mile marker 30. The fog cleared suddenly, revealing the most dangerous part of the devil's backbone ahead. Devil's Curve, where the road bent 90 degrees around a rocky outcrop with nothing but a rusted guardrail between travelers and a 1,000-foot drop into darkness. "Here is where it happens," she said, her voice now coming from everywhere at once. "Here is where you choose." The steering wheel turned in my hands without my input, pointing the car directly at the guardrail. Through the windshield, I could see the black void beyond the edge, hungry and waiting. "Choose?" Her voice echoed inside my skull. "Feed the road your soul and join us forever, or swerve away and give us someone else. Someone you love, Someone waiting for you in a hospital bed, wondering why Daddy never came. The horrible choice crystallized in my mind like ice forming on glass. My daughter, Sarah, 16 years old with her mother's green eyes and my stubborn chin. If I refused the road, it'd sacrifice. If I somehow escaped this nightmare, it would follow me. Find her, take her instead. But as the guardrail rushed toward my headlights, something else occurred to me. Something the woman in yellow hadn't. She considered in her certainty that I would break. You made one mistake, I said, finding my voice at last as my foot slammed down on the accelerator instead of the brake. You assumed I came alone. Her eyes widened with something like surprise as the car smashed through the rusted guardrail and launched into empty air. For a moment we hung suspended above the ravine, gravity forgotten, while she realized her error. I'm already dead, I told her as we began to fall. Heart attack 3 miles back at marker 4. The road didn't choose me. I chose it. Her scream cut through the night air as we plummeted toward the rocks below. A scream of rage and hunger denied, of a plan unraveling like thread. The last thing I saw was her face changing, becoming something even less human, before the world went black. They found my car the next morning, wrapped around a pine tree at the bottom of this ravine. The rescue workers said I must have fallen asleep at the wheel and drifted off the road. A tragic accident. They found no evidence of a passenger, no yellow rain slicker, no hitchhiker with too many teeth. But I know better. I know that sometimes the road, as hunger, can be turned against itself. Sometimes the dead can choose their own sacrifice. And sometimes, just sometimes, a father's love can break even the oldest curses. My daughter got the call about my accident while she was recovering from her appendectomy. She cried at my funeral and wondered why I never made it to see her. She'll never know that I did make it, that I am still making it every night on the devil's backbone. Because now the warning, the choice, the test, and when the next lonely traveler sees me standing on the shoulder with my thumb extended, wearing my torn yellow rain slicker, they'll have the same choice I had, the same chance to save someone they love. The devil's backbone is still hungry. It always will be. But now it has to get through me first. Story 10. Trans-access trailings. The FBI closed my case file yesterday. 3 months of investigation, 24 interviews, and they recalling it a psychological break. But I know what I saw in those mountains, and I know why 17 hikers have vanished without a trace along the Trans-access Trail. My name is David Kowalski, and until last week I was Special Agent Kowalski with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 22 years of service, spotless record, commendations from 3 different directors. Now I am unemployed and under psychiatric evaluation because I told the truth about what is hunting people in the Appalachian Mountains. The Trans-access Trail runs 47 miles through some of the most remote wilderness in West Virginia and Virginia. It connects 2 state parks through terrain so rugged that cell towers can reach most of it. The perfect place for someone to disappear, which is exactly what has been happening for the past 18 months. 17 people, experienced hikers, all of them. They entered the trail system at various points, filed proper permits, carried GPS devices and emergency beacons. Every single one of them vanished between mile marker 12 and mile marker 19, a 7-mile stretch the locals call Dead Valley. No bodies, no blood, no torn clothing or scattered gear. They simply walked into that valley and never walked out. The local authorities were overwhelmed. Mountain rescue teams had searched the area dozens of times without finding so much as a boot print. The media started calling it the Appalachian Bermuda Triangle, which brought in conspiracy theorists and amateur investigators who only complicated the search efforts. That is when the Bureau got involved. My partner, Agent Sarah Chen, and I were assigned to lead a joint task force with state and local law enforcement. Our job was simple: figure out what happened to 17 missing persons and prevent it from happening again. I wish we had never taken the case. Our first step was analyzing the disappearances for patterns. All 17 victims had certain characteristics in common. Solo hikers, ages 25 to 45, experience with wilderness camping, carrying high-end gear. No drugs, no alcohol, no history of mental illness or suicidal behavior. The timeline was disturbing. The disappearances had accelerated over the past 6 months, from one every few months to one every few weeks. Whatever was responsible was getting bolder, hungrier, or more confident. Agent Chen focused on the digital evidence while I interviewed witnesses and family members. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Loving spouses waiting for hikers who never returned. Parents getting that terrible phone call when the permit expired and their child hadn't checked out of the trail system. But it was the search and rescue reports that really caught my attention. Every search team that entered Dead Valley reported the same strange experiences. Equipment malfunctions, GPS devices giving impossible readings, radios picking up voices speaking in languages that didn't sound human. Search dogs refusing to follow scent trails, whimpering and backing away from certain areas as if they sensed something dangerous. The few civilian hikers who made it through Dead Valley alive described an overwhelming sense of being watched. Multiple witnesses reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision, shadows that didn't match the terrain, sounds of footsteps that stopped whenever they turned to look. One survivor, a Marine veteran named Patrick Morris, gave us the most detailed account. He'd been hiking through Dead Valley at dusk when he noticed someone following him. Not obviously, but consistently. A figure moving parallel to the trail, staying just far enough back to remain hidden in the trees. Morris had military training, so he knew how to handle a potential threat. He set up camp in a defensible position and waited. What he saw through his night vision scope challenged everything he thought he knew about human behavior. The figure moved like an animal, not walking upright, but flowing through the forest with impossible grace and speed. It would disappear behind one tree and reappear behind another dozens of yards away, as if it could teleport or move faster than the human eye could track. When Morris tried to photograph it with his camera, the images came out blurred and distorted. When he tried to film it with his phone, the device shut down despite having a full battery. By morning, the figure was gone, but Morris found tracks around his campsite. Human footprints, bare feet with unusually long toes and what looked like claw marks at the tips. The stride length suggested someone over 7 feet tall. Morris hiked out of Dead Valley as fast as he could and never returned to the mountains. His testimony was detailed, consistent, and completely impossible to verify. But it gave us our first real lead. Agent Chen and I decided to conduct our own reconnaissance of the area. We assembled a team of experienced FBI personnel, equipped ourselves with the latest surveillance technology, and entered Dead Valley prepared for anything. Or so we thought. The first day was uneventful. We hiked the trail, documented potential hiding spots, collected soil and vegetation samples, interviewed the few day hikers we encountered. Standard investigative procedure, but as evening approached, the atmosphere changed dramatically. The forest became unnaturally quiet. No bird sounds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of minutes, and fog began rolling in from the valleys below. That's when we started hearing the sounds. Breathing, heavy, rhythmic breathing that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Not human breathing, but something deeper, more labored, like a large animal with lung damage, struggling for air. We activated our recording equipment and tried to triangulate the source, but the sound seemed to move constantly. Sometimes ahead of us on the trail, sometimes behind, sometimes from the canopy above our heads. Agent Chen was monitoring our radio communications when she noticed something disturbing. We were picking up transmissions that weren't coming from any of our team members. Voices speaking in a language none of us recognized, discussing something in urgent, excited tones. The voices seemed to be coordinating with each other, sharing information about our location and movements, as if we were being tracked by multiple entities working together. That night, we made camp in a small clearing about 15 miles into Dead Valley. We established a defensive perimeter with motion sensors and thermal cameras, maintained radio contact with our support team outside the valley, and prepared for a long night of observation. What we observed defied rational explanation. The thermal cameras detected multiple heat signatures moving through the forest around our campsite. Human-shaped figures that registered normal body temperature but moved with inhuman speed and agility. They circled our position for hours, staying just beyond the range of our night vision equipment. Every attempt to get closer visual contact failed. The figures seemed to anticipate our movements, vanishing whenever we tried to approach their location. But they left evidence of their presence. Handprints on trees, disturbed vegetation, and tracks. Always those impossible tracks with the elongated toes and claw marks. Around 3 a.m, Agent Chen made a breakthrough with the radio transmissions. She'd been running them through translation software and finally got a partial match. The language was a dialect of Cherokee. but heavily corrupted and mixed with sounds that didn't correspond to any known human speech patterns. The fragments she could translate were terrifying. References to hunting, to feeding, to something they called the long hunger. Discussions about which members of our team looked the healthiest, the most nutritious. We were being evaluated as food sources. That's when I understood what we were dealing with. Not a single predator, but a group, a tribe, something that had once been human but had adapted to life in the deep mountains, becoming something else entirely. The missing hikers hadn't been killed by bears or mountain lions or human serial killers. They'd been hunted by creatures that knew every inch of Dead Valley, creatures that could move through the forest like ghosts and coordinate their attacks with primitive intelligence. I tried to radio for extraction, but our communications were being jammed. The creatures had learned to use our own technology against us. Every time we transmitted, they transmitted back on the same frequency, drowning out our signals with their inhuman chatter. We were trapped in their territory, cut off from the outside world, with no way to call for help. The second night was worse. The creatures became bolder, moving closer to our campsite. We caught glimpses of them in our peripheral vision. Pale figures with elongated limbs and faces that were almost human but wrong in ways that made our primitive brains scream danger. They began testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. One of our motion sensors detected something moving directly toward the camp, but when we illuminated the area with floodlights, nothing was there. Just disturbed grass and the lingering smell of something wild and unwashed. Agent Chen was monitoring the thermal cameras when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the heat signatures wasn't moving like the others. It was larger, more stationary, positioned on a ridge overlooking our campsite. Through binoculars, we could just make out a silhouette against the stars. Human in general shape but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung almost to its knees and a head that seemed too large for its neck. It was watching us, studying us, learning our patterns and behaviors. The alpha predator, evaluating its prey. By the third day, our team was falling apart. 2 agents had suffered nervous breakdowns and were non-functional. Our equipment kept malfunctioning despite careful maintenance. Our food supplies were running low because we lost our resupply cache to some kind of coordinated theft. The creatures were playing with us, wearing us down psychologically before moving in for the kill. That is when I made the decision that ended my career. Against direct orders from headquarters, I abandoned our mission and led the team out of Dead Valley. We hiked 20 miles in 8 hours, pushing ourselves beyond exhaustion to reach the safety of the trail terminus. 3 agents required hospitalization for dehydration and exhaustion. Agent Chen suffered a complete psychological breakdown and hasn't spoken coherently since we extracted from the mountains. The official report blamed our experiences on high altitude, dehydration, and group hysteria. But I know what we encountered in Dead Valley. I know why 17 people have vanished without a trace. And I know why the FBI will never solve this case using conventional investigative methods. The creatures in those mountains aren't human anymore. They adapted to their environment over generations, becoming perfect predators in one of the most isolated ecosystems in North America. They were intelligent enough to avoid leaving evidence, organized enough to coordinate complex hunts, and patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. They don't to kill quickly. The radio transmissions suggest they keep their prey alive for extended periods, using them as a food source that can be harvested gradually. The missing hikers might still be alive somewhere in the deep caves and hidden valleys of Dead Valley, sustaining a tribe of creatures that evolution forgot. The Bureau closed my case file and transferred the investigation to a junior agent who focus on more conventional theories. Serial killers, human trafficking, organized crime. I'll never find the truth because they were not looking in the right places. But the disappearances will continue. Solo hikers will keep vanishing in Dead Valley, and the search teams will keep finding nothing but strange tracks in disturbed vegetation. The creatures will become bolder as their population grows, eventually expanding their hunting grounds beyond the traditional boundaries. I tried to warn people, posted anonymous messages on hiking forums, contacted journalists, even reached out to cryptozoology researchers. But who is going to believe a disgraced FBI agent with a psychiatric evaluation in his file? The Trans-Access Trail remains open to the public. The missing persons cases are still classified as unsolved. And somewhere in Dead Valley, 17 people are discovering what happens when humans stop being the apex predator. I'm telling this story because someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to understand why certain places in the Appalachian Mountains should be avoided, why some trails should remain closed, why our ancestors had good reasons for staying out of the deep woods. The FBI's Appalachian Unsolved Files contain dozens of cases like the Trans-Access Trailings. Mysterious disappearances in remote wilderness areas, always in locations where cellular coverage is poor and rescue operations are difficult. They were not random. They were not accidents. They were hunting grounds for things that used to be human but chose a different path of evolution. Things that view civilization as an endless buffet of soft, unprepared prey. Stay out of Dead Valley. Stay off the Trans-Access Trail between mile markers 12 and 19. And if you hiking alone in remote mountain wilderness and you start feeling like something is watching you from the trees, trust that instinct. Turn around, leave immediately. Don't to look back, because once they start hunting you, they never stop. Another Appalachian tale fades, but echoes remain. Thank you for stepping off the safe path with me tonight. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. And tell me, where are you listening from? Have your hills ever whispered back? Share your story below, if you're brave enough. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also keep calling.